Bonjour à tous. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here this afternoon for this debate on responsible business conduct. Just a quick reminder, if you want to follow the debate in English, you've got a translation. Channel 1 is in English, Channel 2 is in French. I'm not sure there will be other translation, but I think you can cope with English. We're going to discuss, of course, what has been achieved so far in terms of human rights, social rights, environmental concerns, which have been integrated in a global strategy for multinational enterprises. And of course, a lot of works remains to be done. And that's also why we are here today to discuss these challenges. Of course, OECD is arguably one of the most, if not the most relevant place to have this debate, because it has set some guidelines, some recommendations for companies to promote responsible business conduct, which, by the way, are consistent with the one of the International Labour Organization and the United Nations. Before we start the debate, we are going to talk about to see the broader picture with Roel Neukamp. Sorry if I mispronounce your name. You've been dealing with this issue for some years now at the OECD, and you're the person behind the negotiations that took place in 2011.
Thanks very much for giving me the floor, and it's an honor to speak here. And it's important to stress, I think, that the OECD has its motto this year: investment, investment, investment. But it's very good to stress that responsible business conduct is an integral part of investment policy in the OECD. The OECD thinks that responsible business conduct and investment policy are two sides of the same coin. And without responsible business conduct, there is no support for open investment policies. And developing countries have been consistently asking for responsible investment. And they expressly say, we don't want irresponsible investment. So the development case for responsible business conduct is very clear. Also, the moral case for responsible business conduct is also very clear. Last week, my Chinese colleague actually said, ethically speaking, the OECD guidelines for responsible business conduct are binding, which is interesting to hear from a Chinese government official. But more important maybe for today is the business case for responsible business conduct is also increasingly clear. We have seen many studies. We have been seeing many companies, Unilever, Coca-Cola, saying here that there is a business case and sustainability is profitable. And of course, we have here the B team, which are consisting of leaders in this field, and they consistently say responsible business conduct pays off. Well, the OECD guidelines are the most comprehensive set of standards in the field of responsible business conduct. And they are considered to be the godfather of all responsible business conduct standards, because next year they will be 40 years old. And interestingly enough, they are binding for governments. Governments, and the 46 governments which are part of my committee, they have to set up a complaints mechanism which is called the national contact points. That's quite unique in this field. Of course, it's non-binding for companies, but it doesn't mean that non-binding for companies means that there are no consequences to non-alignment with the OECD guidelines. There can be positive consequences, but there can also be negative consequences. And I will give you two examples of that. Well, this is about a case which has been handled by the National Contact Point of Canada. It's called the China Gold case. It's about a landslide in which 24 people died, and there was a complaint by NGOs against China Gold. Problem is, the company refused to come to the mediation table when offered by the NCP. And interestingly enough, the Canadian government has made a policy coherence decision to link national contact point statements on cases like this to their economic diplomacy instruments. So after China Gold refused cooperation with the National Contact Point of Canada, they lost the support of the Canadian government when it comes to export credits, when it comes to development assistance, etc. So there are really hard consequences to non-cooperation with this system. And of course, there are three major areas of consequences to the system. First of all, it's bad for your reputation if you don't cooperate and if you breach the guidelines and don't try to solve the problem. Second of all, many governments, and the OECD governments have made a commitment that all the export credit agencies should make a link to NCP statements and that they should take into account statements like this. So that's a very strong indication of a consequence. And of course, more and more, the financial sector is attaching consequences to it. So sometimes we see that companies who have had a bad statement see their cost of capital being raised. Of course, this is an example how it should not be going, but this is an example of how it should be going. There was a complaint in the UK and National Contact Point against the company Formula One, which is the international organization organizing these race tournaments. Formula One did the right thing. They came to the mediation table, they talked with the NGOs, and they found an agreement. They agreed to having a human rights policy. They will do human rights impact assessments before they set up a new Formula One. So this is an example, and we have seen many examples like this, where the company works together with an NGO or with trade unions and tries to solve the problem, and they come out as a winner in this field. Of course, we have had many cases like this. The German NCP did a case on health and safety in the Bangladesh textile industry. We have seen many cases related to biodiversity and environmental issues. I hope the Director General of the WWF will talk about the SOCO case, which was a big landmark case in the field of environment. And last week, a new case came in, which is also very interesting, against FIFA. The BWI, which is a trade union, made a case against FIFA that they are contributing to human rights breaches in Qatar related to the World Cup 2022. So the interesting question is, will FIFA do the same thing as the Formula One, and will they go to the mediation table related to human rights issues? Of course, there are just a couple of brief new frontiers for responsible business conduct. First of all, the national contact point performance. It is a very unique situation. We have a complaints mechanism attached to a non-binding instrument on RBC. But of course, everybody knows that there is still much room for improvement for NCP performance. They provide a role on the issue of human rights in business related to the UN guiding principles. They have a role to play on the ILO standards, and of course they are focused on encouraging business to play a positive role when it comes to the sustainable development issues. So it also will be very much linked and relevant for the sustainable development goals. Second of all, supply chain due diligence is a very important and also very complex topic. At the OECD, we came to the conclusion that companies can outsource their production, but they cannot outsource responsibility. That's a very important concept. And we see that in the textile industry, we see that when it comes to conflict minerals, we see that when it comes to the financial sector. And the overarching view of the OECD and the working party I represent is that companies should embed responsible business conduct in its DNA. And not only in its own company, but also in the DNA of its value chain. And that's a real big challenge, but very important. And so it also needs to be embedded in their corporate governance. A third salient policy development, and I will be very brief, is a migration which we see from soft law, which is very often developed in the UN or in the OECD, and it migrates to hard law. A very interesting example worth following is what happens in France, where they made a sort of due diligence act on supply chain responsibility, which is already adopted by the Assemblée. We still have to see what happens in the Senate, but it's a very landmark development. We see it in conflict minerals. The Dodd-Frank bill in the US, the EU is embarking on mandatory due diligence requirements when it comes to conflict minerals. Reporting, also starting as soft law, is now mandatory in India. It's mandatory in the EU. So it's the majority of OECD countries have to make sustainability reports. Many stock exchanges are asking the same thing. So the stock exchanges of Brazil, of South Africa, and many Southeast Asian countries, they are asking companies mandatory to make sustainability reporting. So just to conclude, responsible business conduct is essential for reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's also essential to reach a climate goal and to implement a climate goal, because the Sustainable Development Goals and a climate agreement will never be happening without companies. Companies have to play a role, and companies should play a role, like the B team, in ending poverty and saving the climate. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So before we start the debate, you can also join this debate online. So you have, I'm trying to understand how it works technically. You connect to the OECD hotspot with your smartphone if you have one. And when you are connected, you can go to the site called app.visembly.com. You use the keywords OECD Blue, that's the name of this place, to access the interactive platform. And then you can post messages and questions. And we'll try to respond to these questions at the end of the debate. Joining us for this debate, Jörg Asmussen, German State Secretary at the Federal Ministry for Labor and Social Affairs. Thank you for being here. Marco Lambertini, Director General at WWF International. Corinne Lagache, you've got many hats. I'll maybe mention which here is the most important one, Vice Chair of the Anti-Corruption Task Force at BIAC. Marie-Lise Léon, your National Secretary at the French Union CFDT, and Keith Tuffley, Managing Partner at the B Team. Thank you, all of you, to make this debate possible. Jörg Asmussen, we're going to start with you because you have decided to put this responsible business conduct issue on the agenda of the G7. Does it mean that you hope to bring it to the next level?
This is at least what we're going to try when we have the summit of the G7 leaders right in front of us the upcoming weekend in southern Germany. But I thought it was an especially good occasion to come to the OECD, to this event, because a key milestone that we have in the whole debate about responsible business conduct what are the OECD guidelines for multinational companies, and they were totally revamped in 2011. And this was really key in the whole debate. And I think it's framing the debate up to today, because the milestone was that it was extended, for example, to human rights. Before it dealt with taxes, yes, with anti-corruption, with the environment, but it was really enlarged in 2011. It incorporated the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. It triggered an international debate about, let's say, a smart mix between voluntary and compulsory business conduct that was already touched upon by the introducing statement. And this has led to some consequences. If you take the latest CSR directive in the European Union, which is binding law, after it's transposed international law, but it will be binding law. This has introduced compulsory sustainability reporting for large companies in the EU. And the guidelines from 2011 from the OECD also, for the first time, acknowledged that enterprises have to observe these guidelines wherever they operate, which means as well in the country of origin, as well as in the country of production. So one has to cover with one due diligence the whole supply chain. And this is why this is, for us, a starting point. We have put the due diligence for supply chain management on our G7 agenda, where Germany holds the presidency this year. And we think this is now ripe and the time to deal with this. You can see this when you look at a number of international settings. It's key in the OECD debate. You have this promoted by our presidency at the G7. The ILO conference in 2016 will focus on this. Though this is something after we had some terrible disasters. For example, in Bangladesh, Rana Plaza is the symbol for this, but it's by far not the only case, and it's not the only country where we see this kind of accidents happen. So we have put this on the agenda for this year. We had a stakeholder conference in March in Berlin. I see some people here in the room that were present. And what we try to achieve, that we are able to enforce existing social and labor standards in the whole supply chain. And we want to achieve 3 elements under our presidency. And I will come back to the national contact points that were introduced to us already. The first one, what we want to do, we have the fact that today, currently more than 2 million people that die each year from work-related accidents or work-related health problems. And what we want to try is to make workplaces safer, because for many low-income countries, labor-intensive production is a development chance, and we want to, of course, focus on this. And what we want to establish is a kind of global prevention fund. We call it the Vision Zero Fund, because the vision is that we have 0 occupational accidents. And we want to provide systematic support to countries to improve the safety at work. For example, one can help labor inspectors to do on-site inspections. One could try to create structures in these countries about occupation-related injury insurances. So this is one thing that we want to do in setting up the fund in coordination with the International Labour Organization. The second, what we want to do in our G7 presidency under the supply chain topic, is to provide some guidance, especially for small and medium-sized companies. We have a growing number of often informal, non-binding guidelines, and especially for SMEs, which are more and more part of the focus because they are part somewhere in the supply chain. It's difficult to see what is important for me, what do I have to follow, how can I organize this, because they have limited resources compared to global acting companies. And here we want to create a framework where we have a common understanding of the due diligence of supply chain management for SMEs. And the third, and this is my final point, and I come back now, of course, deliberately to the OECD, is that we want to help to strengthen the OECD national contact points. We think they are unique in their structure. They are very good. The acceptance and the knowledge about these national contact points has very much increased. For example, in Germany now we have 10 cases. At the beginning we always had 0 in each year. This now has increased, so companies, trade unions, other NGOs know more and more that these contact points exist and how they function. But we think, and Raul said this at the beginning, that there is room for improvement. And we want to organize a kind of peer review, because these national contact points are, for example, very differently organized in the states, the member states of the OECD that adhere to it. So this is why we want to organize a kind of peer review. We hope that all G7 will lead by example in doing the same. We have committed ourselves to do this kind of peer review under the OECD helm in 2017. And we hope that others follow so that we can improve something that is already very good. So this is, in the sustainable supply chain management, the work program of the German G7 presidency.
Thank you. You've mentioned the accident in Bangladesh and that cost hundreds of lives. I forgot to tell you what the question was. If you want to take part to the Visembly poll, the question is, when you shop, do you check where your clothes are produced? So that's the survey online. You can participate, and we'll check your answer at the end of this debate. Now, when we prepared this panel, we realized that there is sometimes a significant gap between what companies can claim in terms of responsible business conduct and what they are actually doing on the ground. Corinne Lagache, maybe you have the answer or part of the answer. What has been done really on the ground? What are the efforts taken by large multinational companies in terms of responsible business conduct?
Today, a large company and now small and middle-sized companies too, I think it's part of the business today, of the strategy of a company, to have a corporate social responsibility strategy, including environment, human rights, business ethics, and to put in place robust risk prevention programs. It is required by our stakeholders, of course, shareholders, but also the civil society or customers. We have to report what we have done, and it's part of the, I would say, of the value of a company today. So it's not a question to if we can or not, if we want or not implement a robust CSR strategy. It is mandatory today. Nevertheless, you mentioned the New Diligence Act in France, following the Bangladesh crisis. You mentioned the conflict minerals. We act also against corruption, but what are exactly the limits for the companies in terms of this risk prevention? What we observe is that very often it is asked to companies to be a substitute of what the state in general are not doing in terms of regulation. In terms of corruption, environment, we are not playing in a fair game because we are in the OECD facilities. You, of course, know that many countries, very powerful countries, are not OECD members. Even some of them are not joining the OECD conventions against corruption. But we have, as Western company, to implement these requirements. We want to implement them, but we are competing with competitors who are not at all the same constraint than us. And maybe some of them, very powerful country, we will also impose us new regulation. So we are facing an inflation of hard law, soft law, requirement for the social, for the civil, from the civil society. But we observe the G20s, B20s, G7, the OECD meetings, the United Nations Global Compact meetings. It's really nice, but in terms of actions, in terms of creation of a level playing field of regulation, we don't see many improvements. And in the case of the Bangladesh, some companies were asked to replace the Bangladesh state in terms of protecting and to be a substitute of what the state doesn't do, which is for us really a problem because that creates uncertainty. The business doesn't like at all uncertainty. And we really ask, please apply the guidelines of the OECD, please apply the business ethics requirement, but please state, fight against solicitation, fight against lack of non-harmonization in terms of human rights and social conditions, because we are not able to act and to regulate on behalf of the state.
Let's see with Marie-Lise, who sits next to you. You are representing the French union CFDT. I assume that you don't have exactly the same point of view. Do you think that there is too much pressure on companies and not enough being done by governments? And by the way, if you could also comment the fact that the French government pushed forward the due diligence thing, and now that we're waiting the discussions at the Senate, what do you make of it?
Oui, c'est bon.
Good. You have the translation.
Prefer continue in French. Merci.
Thank you for inviting me. The whole purpose of having a panel is to have different opinions, right? We don't have to agree on everything. And perhaps it's a good idea to abandon some old cliches that, for instance, that trade unions and companies disagree on everything, especially if we're talking about responsible business conduct, because there is a real discussion within a given company, with the trade unions in particular, and that we all have to take into account the external environment, not just the environment in the ecological sense. There's a whole new dialogue with different players and more contacts with all of the players, all of the stakeholders. The context is now interesting. In France, what we're seeing is a bill that's being presented on due diligence. From our point of view, as a trade union, we don't see this as being incompatible with the issue of negotiations or trade union discussions. Now, trade unions are there to defend employees and to reflect on social issues. And what we are increasingly focusing on is the importance of having a discussion not just on the economy, but also on the environment. The whole issue being how we need to take on board all of these issues through guidelines, through directives, and so forth, and through the legal framework that will apply to all the stakeholders within a given company. The whole issue of due diligence is symptomatic of the fact that we've come to the limits of what industrial dialogue can lead to, of what trade employer-employee discussions can lead to, collective discussions. And what does this dialogue produce? How can it be implemented? And what kind of rights can it lead to? So there's a bill that was voted by Parliament on March 30. And that bill doesn't exactly live up to all of our expectations, even if we do recognize that it is a step forward. A number of other European countries have taken the same steps and have introduced due diligence as a legal obligation. This means that the law covers the defense of fundamental rights, recognizing that good intentions are not enough.
On the German side, we sometimes agree with French unions. It goes into the right direction for you.
I mean, without interfering into French domestic politics. So this is what a trained civil servant says as a starting point. I mean, we have put the topic of sustainable supply chain management on the agenda of our G7 presidency. We have an extremely close cooperation, let's say, between the German Ministry of Labor and the French Ministry of Labor. So I'm aware in general terms, not every single sentence or word of the bill that was presented, but I think it goes in the right direction. In the G7, we are doing something different, but the topic which we are aiming is the same: to introduce core labor, social and environmental standards in global supply chain. What they are doing in France, they make hard law. The G7 is an informal grouping of 7 countries that share common values about a social market economy, about democracy, but it's an informal grouping. So we try to develop a joint understanding of the topic and to lead by example, and then to inspire, yes, to be frank, organizations like the OECD, of which the G7 are all members. But of course, we want to reach out. I mean, just the 7, it's important, but it's not enough. So we want to reach out to institutions like the OECD, we want to reach out to the G20, and of course, then everyone has to take steps at home. This means exactly leading by example. France is doing it here in one very crucial aspect.
Corinne, you wanted to step in?
Yes, but in fact, we are not against the Due Diligence Act at all. We require to have something, to have guidelines. The issue is that we are not part of the debate, of the discussion for the implementation, and we say it's nice to have a hard law, but what is the following? What are the implementation decrees? What we have to put in place? And they say, but take care of this by yourself. It's not acceptable today because we have to know what we have to develop, to have guidance, to have real discussion with the politics level, their expectation, to have better communication together. We are responsible, we are not liable, you know, and we don't want to be considered as a liable. We are citizens of the world, we employ people. And, you know, at the end, some colleagues told me to be a pure ethical company, we have to stop employ people, to stop to do business, to stop purchasing goods, and then you will be perfect, which is not our goal.
Before we move forward, you can still take part to the survey that we've put online when you shop, when you buy your clothes. Do you check systematically where they are produced? So there are different ways for you to vote. Via the OECD info app, click on Connect icon and enter OECD Blue. Via the web, you go to app.visembly.com/OECD Blue or via Twitter with the hashtag OECD Blue, and we'll check the results of this survey at the end of the debate. Let's now talk to the people who haven't talked yet. The women are talking a lot, aren't they? First, with you, Marco, you're Director General of WWF, and you were telling me when we prepared this debate that there is a sentiment, there's a view that this responsible business conduct is not always good for business, and of course it's something that you don't share.
No, we don't share. We believe that, so we are an organization that is obviously debating now not whether to develop or not to develop, but how to develop. And this is really the question that is on the table. Let me make a comment and take you to a high systemic level. I think there is a big issue that we're facing as actually civilization, which is about decoupling our current human economic development from high footprint on the natural systems. Since the Industrial Revolution, and even more so from mid-last century, the acceleration of the consumption and our entire economy has been based on a really heavy use of natural resources, generating incredibly high footprint. The science today is very clear. An acceleration of the type is just not sustainable. So basically, Planet Earth enterprise is running a huge deficit every year, and this is going to bring us to bankruptcy in terms of social system, economic systems, and natural systems, all connected together. And these are people, planet, prosperity, the three words that inspires this conference. At a more practical level, businesses, and I have to say, we have seen huge progress in the corporate sector in terms of really trying hard to internalize and apply principle of sustainability, particularly, inevitably, at the high multinational level, but increasingly also the SME level in many countries around the world. But they are still seeing not enough internalization of the three, what we say in WWF, the three R's. Respect from the rules, the regulations that protect natural places and services that these natural places provide to all of us, including businesses. Water, clean air, a lot of other services that ecosystems provide to us daily for free, and we take for granted too much. Second R is actually risk. So managing the risk in terms of reputation and also security of supply chains, for example, in many places, by not acting responsibly where businesses operate. And the third one is responsibility, because there is an expectation increasingly in the public, in the consumers, around the world, not just in the West and the North, in fact, growing very fast in the East and the South, about businesses doing good, not just for themselves, which is obviously, you know, business for profit, but for the communities and increasingly for the environment. Because some people are increasingly aware of the issues we're facing, are feeling the impact on the environment on their own lives. Last year was the hottest year on record. People felt on their skin. Last year was the superstorm ever recorded in history that killed thousands and thousands of people in the Philippines. They feel it in their heart for the unnecessary loss of lives due to extreme weather. And so this is beginning to also hit the economy. When the typhoon in the Philippines or the floods in Thailand has hit 2-3% of the GDP for that year. And the harsh winter in the US this year has actually contributed to almost level to zero the first quarter growth. So the key question, however, is how to translate all this, how to internalize all these concepts of sustainability, but also how to translate it on the real world. And this is where I think is time for businesses and governments, and not just businesses, but of course government, particularly subnational governments, to really begin to work at a very serious integrated planning level at the landscape level. This is where economy meets the environment. This is decisions are made and where people produce and run economy. And this is where we need to bring together around the table all the players that need to be at the table to really develop integrated planning about economy, about environment, about just social development.
Stakeholders can raise complaints to their national contact points. There are 46 of them. How do you think it's possible to improve their effectiveness?
So we have in WWF, and I think Newcamp mentioned this in his opening, we had a very inspiring experience last year about actually using, for the first time in our case, the guidelines and the complaint mechanism of OECD to actually open a mediation and a discussion with an oil company, SOCO, UK-based oil company operating in DRC. And our experience was extremely positive in terms of actually reaching an agreement with the company, and the company decided to actually pull out from the national park where they were planning to extract oil. By the way, the oldest national park in Africa, Virunga. And so in that sense was an extremely positive experience. On the other hand, we found the mechanism pretty cumbersome, pretty complicated. And so I think it's going to be really important to strengthen the guidelines by increase the accessibility to civil society. And I think this is really what we have to try and do. Simplify and make the guidelines more accessible to civil society groups around the world to engage in dialogues and mediations with companies when companies don't do the right things or they don't know that they're doing the right things. But of course, there is another dimension. It would be fantastic if the guidelines could begin to enter a space of prevention, so that actually we engage in the discussions at a planning level, avoiding risk, avoiding waste of time, waste of money, and avoiding to actually enter dialogue when the problem is already happening and when the issues are already more difficult to solve. So these are the two dimensions that we would like to strengthen: simplicity and accessibility, and actually have the guidelines play a more preventative role.
Thank you. Let's bring in Keith Tuffley, your managing partner at the B team. How do you think peer review and peer learning should be promoted?
Yes, so thank you. So for those that aren't familiar with the B team, it's a group of business leaders, including Jochen Zeitz, the ex-CEO of Puma, Richard Branson, Paul Polman, Guillaume Eliel, Ariana Huffington, Mo Ibrahim. And the purpose of the B team is to instill and encourage other companies in the private sector to be a driving force for economic, social and environmental good. Now, the whole idea is to be positioned at the more progressive end of the spectrum. And so when it comes to the question about sort of peer review and peer support, it is also about sort of breaking down the barriers of sort of the typical competitive juices between competitors, and trying to encourage as much collaboration within sectors as possible to solve some of these big global systemic problems that Marco just mentioned. Because some of these issues we just simply will not solve without very, very strong corporate leadership and corporate support. So when it comes to the peer learning, there are four areas that we focus on. One is actually about the definition of corporate leadership and responsibility. And that means defining the role of the CEO and the role of the company well beyond the traditional sort of short-term financial value perspective only. It also means defining the responsibilities well beyond the core components of the company throughout the entire supply chain. That also, we mentioned the supply chain a lot, but also means the entire value chain, because also about where your products end up. Now, I'll just use a very simple example at the moment, because there's a little project called Race for Water, which comprises a very small NGO. They've got a catamaran in the middle of the Pacific at the moment, and they're exploring all of the plastic that's in the middle of the oceans It's a tiny NGO. They've estimated there's about 8 million tonnes of plastic that's pumped out into the oceans every year by us. That's estimated to increase to about 160 million tonnes in the next 10 years. Now, at that rate, we're going to have 1 kilogram of plastic in the oceans for every 3 kilograms of fish, which is an extraordinary statistic. Now, who takes responsibility for that? We think about the supply chain, but often we forget about the ultimate end of the products. You know, is it the oil companies? Is it the chemical companies? Is it the waste management companies? But ultimately, what we're on about is taking that full responsibility for the products and the services. Secondly, it's about open sourcing of technology and of innovations. So one of our members is the Caring Group, a very well-known French Paris-based company. Many of you will be aware that two weeks ago they announced their environmental profit and loss statement, which is a very innovative approach to valuing all of the environmental impacts of the company right through the supply chain, and then monetising those impacts in a form that any CFO, and for that matter anyone in the capital markets, can understand. And further than that, they announced it. So again, it's not just internalising, it's actually making it public. And fourthly, it's open sourcing the methodology. So in effect, they are investing in that, not just for themselves, but for anyone to now use. And we're talking also about smaller companies. Smaller companies need this. Smaller companies can't afford that sort of research and that sort of technology and innovation. So again, we're on about very much supporting that ongoing open sourcing of methodologies to how to measure impacts, both environmental and social. It's about sharing information as well, not just open sourcing, it's sharing. So again, breaking down the competitive juices within sectors. I mean, I have spent 25 years in the capital markets and investment banking, and the concept of investment banks getting together and sharing better ways of doing things together was sometimes pretty unheard of. But we actually need to do that, and we need to break those barriers down to encourage greater sharing of such solutions. And then lastly, it's around challenging each other. So our organisation is not about moving at the slowest pace. For example, many industries bodies only move as fast as the slowest common denominator. What we try and do is move as fast as the fastest three on a particular initiative. So we're not dragged back by the slowest. We're actually trying to get the slowest to get on the bus on a particular initiative to move as fast as the fastest. And again, it's about not relying on governments, not relying on the law, but actually come up with innovations so that business is coming up with solutions. Because business can generally move faster than the law can. And so coming up with those solutions led by business and redefining the role of the CEO and the role of the company to a much broader social and environmental impact is critical for us to solve some of these big systemic issues.
Thank you. Maybe we can talk also about social rights and labor rights with you, Marie-Lise Léon, because we've talking a lot about environment. But it's not the only issue, and it's also a significant part of this responsible business conduct. You're representing a French union, so how are you pushing into that direction to improve social rights?
Well, I guess I'm going to be responsible for talking on behalf of all employees. Yes, it is my job, and I'm very glad of it. But social issues can't be disconnected from environmental ones anymore, or economic ones for that matter. What we're seeing, as the gentleman from WWF was saying, there's COP21. We need to reach an agreement here in Paris at the end of the year. The climate issue has to be tackled now, not tomorrow. It's all about what has to happen now. We need to rethink the model we want, the development model we want. Not necessarily the opposite of growth, but we need to perhaps invent a new model for growth. And we think that responsible business conduct and the involvement of all the stakeholders through a quality social dialogue will enable us to get to a more effective, more efficient process. Now, perhaps my neighbor will see things differently. You can have a different view on the part of employers, for example, on what responsible business conduct should be. But you can't have responsible business conduct if you don't talk to the other stakeholders. Now, is social dialogue, is environmental dialogue or economic dialogue a constraint? We have very cumbersome labor laws, but is it a factor of, is it a problem for companies, or is it a source of value? I'm convinced that it's a source of value. As our neighbor on the left said, there are two issues here that we need to think about. The issue of governance, who's legitimate, who can contribute to defining responsible business conducts and business conducts in general. You can't have intelligent social standards unless you talk to employees and trade unions, and unless you talk to all the stakeholders. Stakeholders who have an interest in having companies, including if they have a negative environmental impact, but that contribute to creating wealth. So there's the issue of governance, in my opinion, and transparency. Quality information is essential in a dialogue. Hence, the importance of the national contact points, which have to be very effective. We work with NGOs, and the NGOs tell us how hard it is to put together a case and to describe the circumstances. This can be a big problem. You were talking about poorly functioning processes, and you mentioned the idea of having reviews. That could be interesting. But also, when answers get no, when questions don't get an answer, what happens? For example, if a company isn't cooperating and isn't responding to questions, what are the risks for that company? That has to be brought and discussed.
To challenge the common perception often that environmental issues and social issues sits on different benches. In fact, they're always intertwined. And our, for example, campaign on the Virunga that I mentioned before, our case in the discussion with SOCO was actually equally based on environmental and social issues. For the benefits that the park was bringing to the people in the area, on the particular very poor area of DRC, and for the impact that that particular business development, oil exploration, could have had on the actual livelihoods of the people in the country. In fact, our report on the region, in fact, our report was mainly about making an economic case for why the park shouldn't be affected, because it was actually a very direct source of income and livelihood for the local people, local communities in that particular landscape.
We're talking a lot about multinational companies, but what about smaller companies, Keith? How can small and medium-sized companies can cope with all this debate and the guidelines to implement? I mean, they don't always see the point in their day-to-day business.
Yeah, no, look, it's tough. It's tough. I mean, when it comes to due diligence, I'm also involved with an impact investing firm, so we invest in businesses that have a positive social and environmental impact, and it's expensive. It is tough work. It requires, at the end of the day, bigger companies to do that work first, because they're the ones who are better able to resource it, to provide the skills, the expertise. You know, I mentioned Caring a moment ago in the context of them being able to be an innovator here and open source it, and that provides a platform for other firms, big and small, but certainly the smaller ones, to be able to use that technology innovation and then to roll it out for their own social and environmental impacts. I mean, you're probably all aware of the B Corps movement. There's about 1,200 B Corps now. That's not part of the B team, or we have a joint venture. It just happens we're both Bs, but we have a joint venture going, and that's called Born B. And the whole project is around ensuring that as many companies as possible that are set up today are starting as B Corps. And the reason being, it's a lot easier to create the DNA of a B Corp, being social, environmental, purpose in a company alongside your obviously you have to have financial purpose, otherwise you go bust and that's not sustainable. So alongside financial purpose as part of the DNA. So it's not a separate division. It's not sort of having an environmental or sustainability department that's always or often subsidiary to the financial department. Actually is it's part of the business. Natura, who I mentioned a moment ago, a fantastic Brazilian company, they just become the first listed B Corp in the world. And there's a second one now. But that means only 2 B Corps globally in the world. And we would love to see that to be really become a real movement. And that, yeah, as I said, it becomes part of the DNA. Now, once it's part of the DNA, then it's a lot easier to instill your employees, to instill your board, to instill your senior management team to say, you know what, it's worth the investment of time and effort. It also determines, you know, what sort of people skills you get on board. So, you know, there's a lot of issues you can deal with when it comes to smaller companies, but the biggest issue that we find is the initial cost of, for example, due diligence, understand the supply chain. It's complex. We've created the most complex supply chains we can possibly imagine in this world. We're creating incredible efficiencies, but also incredible lack of transparency. And so the reliance that the smaller companies have on larger companies to invest in this area and then to be able to then transpose those skills and those resources across to smaller companies is absolutely critical.
Corinne, also, you
Yes.
think that complexity and cost are the main problem for SMEs?
It's a cost, but SMEs are very often suppliers of large companies. Large companies cascade the ethics, CSR requirements to their suppliers, imposing commitments on different subjects. So they are forced, if they want to work at the international level or with large companies, to implement the same responsible conduct program, but we try to support them, especially through sectorial collective actions or multi-sectorial collective action. Large companies developed best practices and really concrete tools in order for the SMEs to implement them in an adequate, of course, way, because we don't want to impose them to have over sizes programs when they don't need it, but really to implement appropriate programs, and they benefit from our experience. So we are doing this through different initiatives in the aerospace and defense, in the extractive industry, in the retail industry, in finance sector too, in order to support these SMEs.
Let's talk about the global picture with you, Jörg Asmussen. China is not part of the OECD. China is a huge market. It's an important market for a lot of companies. How can we set some guidelines at an international level without having China at the table? Do you think the G7 discussions will help in that sense?
You could argue that China is also not part of the G7. But I think we can start this debate. Let's take the 7 or also take the OECD, where China is obviously not a member, but it appears to me that it's approaching the business of the OECD, put it like this. Yeah. What we are very key from the German G7 presidency that on this kind of topics we want to reach out to the G20. Yeah, this is the group where you have the 7 most advanced economies plus 13 emerging market economies on the table, including China, India, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, for example. So this is the starting point for us is the G7, which is often easy because, as I said, the 7 are also a group of shared values. It's like the European Union. And then you reach out to other constituencies, to other countries, which might have different political or economic systems, but we reach out. So this is the approach where you start as an informal setting. The G7, you use international organization like the OECD. They have, of course, more binding value to members, but they are not with zero effect on non-members. And third, when you move away from the company level, we had a debate, what should companies do and what should countries do? If you move to the companies level, if you take a due diligence across the whole supply chain, you could be a company that has its headquarter in France or in Germany or in Belgium or wherever, or in the US or in Canada, but if you source in from a factory in China, this is then to be taken into account. So this, where you have complements between what states do and what enterprises or companies do.
Maybe also you could step in as the head of WWF, because
Ce serait peut-être le moment pour vous d'intervenir en tant que chef du WWF, puisqu'on parle de la Chine. Oui, effectivement, la Chine, c'est la patrie des pandas, animal auquel WWF est historiquement très attaché. Alors vous dites que la Chine n'est pas à la table. Quelle table? Celle de l'OCDE.
Very bold steps, and sometimes even bolder than a number of other countries in terms of dealing with some really pressing issues that, of course, the country is acutely suffering from, like air pollution, water pollution, and making very significant commitments, as we have heard recently, particularly on the coal dimension, where for the first time ever, historically, China has decreased the consumption of coal and is actually beginning to talk about peaking coal consumption. So the other interesting dimension is the beginning of the discussion that China is having about their own global role. And so until now, the focus has been domestic, but now increasingly it is international. As they realize they're a global player and they're recognized as such, they're beginning to actually look at their footprint elsewhere. And we are embarking, for example, on a very interesting discussion on how to support their new banks, infrastructure banks particularly, in terms of adopting environmental safeguards. And this is an ongoing debate and discussion that I think is making us in WWF feeling extremely encouraged by the steps China is making today.
Corinne, do you feel that China is ready to follow the guidelines that are set internationally, or it would like to implement its own rules as it's a big market? You work with China.
Yes, we work with China. We have joint venture with China. We work with Chinese customers, and they send us a questionnaire with strict ethical requirements. You know, they have to be, if they want to be global and international, they have also to follow rules. Maybe they won't join the OECD. They will impose their Asian rules, but they have to meet some requirements, otherwise we can't work with them. Because at the short-term level it could be good, at the long term I don't know. So we see a huge shift in the fight against corruption. I don't want to debate about the reason, but if you go to China, it's still really polluted. Nevertheless, you won't see any more people buying luxury goods because they are really afraid and worrying about the fight against corruption locally. Even the Western countries, company working in China have to comply with strict rules. So we see really evolution. Then I don't know if they will join they join the United Nations Conventions Against Corruption. They don't join the OECD Conventions Against Corruption. I'm not sure that they want to join them. But we have to be pragmatical and to see how we could meet, you know, unions, companies, to install a better communication, and what will be also our power to fight against their huge power. I don't know.
Who should be around the... Yeah, you want to step in?
Can I make... Oh. It doesn't work. Oh, it works. Can I make a very brief comment on China? I just came back from China, and we had an OECD meeting with the Chinese industry and with the government. And of course, this is a very relevant discussion, because without China, there's no really relevant discussion. But it's important to see that the Chinese have a very strong interest in responsible business conduct. And why? Because they got into trouble with their investment. They lost a lot of money. And they are convinced of the business case. So that's why the OECD is working together with the industry, for example, in mining and minerals, to develop supply chain due diligence guidelines, which are basically the same kind of values we are fostering, and, for example, the Chinese textile industry is working with the OECD in developing supply chain due diligence guidelines for the textile and garment industry. So there is a lot of engagement with China. Of course, to sign up to the OECD guidelines for RBC, that's maybe a bridge too far, but there is a lot of strong engagement and a lot of interest out of self-interest and out of the conviction on a business case.
Talking about textile, I remind you, you can still vote to our panel. When you shop, do you check where the clothes are produced? We've seen already some answers, and we'll check the result of this survey at the end of the discussion. We've got less than 15 minutes left. Jörg Asmussen, maybe it's time to start to draw some conclusions. How confident are you that things will improve significantly under the German presidency of the G7?
I mean, I'm not going to prejudge what G7 leaders will discuss and decide in the next Sunday in southern Germany, but the talks that we had in preparing this, the normal working level context that we have between countries, I'm relatively optimistic that we can achieve something here in the cooperation between labor ministries, development ministries, international organizations like the OECD or the ILO, because it's a topic that has reached global attention in recent years due to some very sad events. But it's something where you have a global debate. We had this, for example, at the G20 Labour Ministers meeting the last time in Melbourne in the fall of last year. And I'm confident that will reach sufficient consensus in doing peer reviews for the national contact points of the OECD. Maybe you start, let's say, to have a different title, because national contact points is a bit pointless. You have to say, for what is it all about? Yeah, it's very technocratic to have a national contact point. You have probably in Germany, we have 28 different national contact points for various things. But for the peer review, there is a broad consensus. For setting up the Vision Zero Fund to provide assistance to producing countries in really making workplace safer, there, I suppose, also a broad support. I mean, the truth is, at the very end, if you have to put money on the table, the German government is willing to put money on the table, and we hope and we are optimistic that others will follow. So I think that we can add a little bit of making workplaces globally. It's not just making workplaces in France or in Germany safer. Yeah, we have a broader perspective. There is a global agenda that we have, that we want to make good work, quality work possible across the globe. Yeah, you can always say, oh, this is too little what you do, and maybe you always debate with NGOs, it's not enough, you should go for hard law, not for soft law. This is a long-standing debate. I think progress always is slow, but as long as there is progress, that's good.
Thank you. Let's see the result of the survey, or how it stands now. When you shop, do you check where your clothes are produced? Yes, 53%. No, 47%. So that's a yes, but that's a, let's say, a shy answer. Yes, it's not a huge pressure, Marco. I have the feeling it doesn't put a lot of pressure on companies to improve or to change their behavior when it comes to responsible business conduct. With an 80% yes, it would have been a significant pressure with a 53%. So maybe we can add another question, by the way. Will you check in the future? And you can vote still and check if you're ready to change your view on that.
So first of all, I have to say the global trend in consuming sustainable goods, it's rocketing. So I'm not sure what the audience representation of the society is, but clearly I think there are many signs of a great responsibility in consumption, which is growing also actually in non-usual suspect countries. Let me say two things. First of all, in WWF we feel extremely excited, and On one hand, there is a huge ecological crisis waiting for us if we don't rectify our course of action. But on the other hand, we feel we are really at the beginning. In fact, we are already in a transition mode. Transition towards clean energy, transition towards sustainable production and consumption. And so the discussions that we're having today, the innovation that is actually flourishing today, the commitment that we are hearing from businesses, particularly revolutionary in the last few years, is extremely encouraging. People, Planet, Prosperity is the tagline of a conference of OECD. The Sustainable Development Goals in September are going to talk about ecological sustainability across poverty alleviation, economic development, and so on and so forth. So we are really beginning to understand that economy, social development, and environmental protection are part of the same plan, in the same picture. And I think this is very exciting. OECD has a great role to play in terms of bringing together governments who are the ones to do regulation, businesses who are the ones who take on the challenge of actually developing a sustainable models of production, and the investors, the finance sector, who is the one who really needs to decide where to put their money. And we are seeing a big shifts already there too. We just heard the Norwegian fund last week getting out of coal, great achievement, and I think more to come.
Corinne, I see that you agree with that statement, but finance is sometimes the limit to responsible business conduct.
It's difficult for me to speak about all the finance sector, but in terms of investors and shareholders, we receive more and more, and that's a very different questionnaire about our responsible conduct in order to show evidence of the robustness of the program, because for them it's a key point in terms of investment. We saw also that in the finance, the banks has been sanctioned for infraction to sanctions, embargoes, things like that. And for them, it was like a traumatized. So they are more and more concerned to work with responsible customers. Sometimes for certain countries, we see also over-compliance because, again, they don't have clear guidance from the state on what they can do and what they can't do in order to not be prosecuted in several years because they didn't act in a proper way. So it's a big issue. And I think states have really to commit to invest in strict and clear guidelines for finance, for industries, for what we have to do.
Marie-Lise, I'm sorry, you're going to represent again working people, but do you have the feeling that because or thanks or after the crisis, unions will have more or less to say in the negotiations? Because the feeling on the ground is that now people get more obsessed about their jobs than social responsibility. You know what I mean? Je peux vous reposer la question en français, si vous voulez.
I think, in fact, what we're seeing is an opposite trend. The CFDT is a member of the ITUC, and the ITUC has a clearly taken position within the COP21 context. That position can be summarized by the phrase, there are no jobs on a dead planet. So obviously there can't be jobs on a planet that is dead. There can't be jobs created either when the economy isn't working. So obviously we want jobs to be created, but we mustn't ever forget that things like CSR and due diligence go to the heart of basic human rights. What we're talking about are decent working conditions, on proper working hours, on proper working and safety conditions. but this needs to be enshrined in laws. These laws already exist in some countries, not in others, but it's not something that governments should do alone, following a top-down approach. It's something that has to be done in cooperation with the private sector and with workers. Again, the game isn't about pointing fingers at anyone. The goal isn't to blame. No, our purpose is to protect wage earners and workers, to ensure that rules are obeyed, and to give victims some sort of redress when accidents occur.
Will you check in the future where your clothes are produced? That's the second question of our poll. Keith, we are going to finish with you this debate. You'll have the final words. Are you confident that we're going into the right direction?
Well, I finished on this note. That's good. I am. I personally am. I mean, I think there's some in our group who are not. I mean, I was in Paris 2 weeks ago for the Business and Climate Summit, and I personally felt there was a tremendous turnout from large companies, CEOs, together with the government, together with NGOs, working together in absolutely the right direction when it came to the climate. I think we had a lot of work to do on the Sustainable Development Goals to get to the same level of momentum, a lot of work to get to ensure they're running together and to ensure there's a real business case for the Sustainable Development Goals. I think one of the exciting things we're going to be facing is, I think, a revolution in transparency going forward. One, because we need it, I think, from both an investor perspective as well as from a consumer perspective, and because the innovations now in the technology that allows both companies, consumers, and investors to understand the true social and environmental impact of company actions, as well as on the products that we buy and the investments that we make. We're demanding it. Consumers are demanding it, investors are demanding it, and the world demands it. And it's when we get that greater transparency, we've got better information to make better decisions. And we're absolutely confident we're going to go through a very, very exciting revolution to achieve that. That creates jobs in itself, but it certainly creates better business decisions across the board. And ultimately, you know, the question that's being asked is, do you look at the label as to where your clothes were made? I'm not sure if that's actually the right question. It's not where it's made. Whether it was made in Bangladesh or around the street, you know, how do you make a decision based on that alone? That's not the point. The point is, what is the environmental and social impact of that product versus the price you're paying for it? What is the world paying? What are we not internalising? We're externalising it because we as consumers, or we as companies, or we as investors are not properly pricing the product or the service that we're producing. And
but how can we change that? Because for most people, price is the main criterion.
Well, there's a few ways we can change it. Firstly, there's a whole bunch of ways we can change it. Consumers demand it. You know, Marco mentioned this. We want more consumers to say, there are more consumers. There's a new generation of consumers out there who are demanding it. Investors need to demand it. At the end of the day, we hear this all the time from CEOs and CFOs who are saying, we're not hearing that from our investors. Well, we need investors, therefore, to say it. We need large pension funds and other investors to keep saying we need greater transparency. And we need, what I said from the start, is corporate leaders to say they've got a greater responsibility to society, to the world, to our people, planet, and prosperity to solve these problems. So there are many ways we can do it. At the end of the day, I think we all have the responsibility in whatever hat we're wearing to solve these social and environmental challenges that we face.
We have actually a bit more time. I just was wrong about the end time.
That wasn't the last word then.
No, you were not the last one, but perhaps also we could include again a rule, because we have the COP21, of course, summit at the end of the year in Paris, the summit on climate change, and that, of course, could help or increase the pressure on companies to move towards a more responsible behavior. Don't you think so?
Well, yes, but I think we all recognise that that Paris this year, I mean, based on the current commitments that are rolling in, we're probably going to get about 20 to 25% of the way to 2 degrees. So this is just one step on the road. I mean, what is the definition of success or failure in Paris in December, I think, is uncertain. The commitments are a step in the right direction, but they're only a very, as I said, 20, 25, maybe 30% of the way to achieving 2 degrees. And by the way, we think 2 degrees is too high. We think that 2,100 for net zero greenhouse gases is way too lazy and is not in accordance with a sensible treatment of our planet. 33% chance of failure, which is what the IPCC science says, based on zero greenhouse gases by 2100. I mean, it's not a risk factor that we're at all happy with. I mean, 33% chance of going in excess of 2 degrees is way too high. So we think we have to get even more progressive in terms of the goal that we're trying to achieve. But certainly Paris, COP21, it's absolutely critical that we get a major step forward, but it's one step on the way to many more steps.
Marco, you're the panda guy here. I feel that you have to add something.
The panda guy is very worried about the climate, like everybody else. But I think I agree with Keith. I think Paris is critical in terms of generating the confidence to move forward. Because after so many flat failures in the past, I think Paris cannot fail the way Copenhagen did. Let's be very, very honest. And I don't think he will. I think Paris has the opportunity, has the potential to really commit the world to maybe not immediately the solution to the 2 degrees, in fact, 1.5 degrees, which is what we really are advocating in WWF, but really pave the way for a journey of increasing commitment in the next couple of decades that will actually solve the problem. And the signs are very encouraging that actually Paris will be able to deliver something significant.
Something you may find encouraging, we've got the result of the second survey. 60% of respondents say that they will check in the future where their clothes are manufactured, and that's to compare with 53% who were saying that they are currently checking. But as you were saying, the location is not the only criteria we should take into account.
Well, I guess if you ask the question, would you buy a piece of furniture which is coming from a tropical forest that you actually don't know whether it is legally or illegally logged? Would you really buy that? Would you be feeling comfortable? I would imagine that majority in the room would say no. I wouldn't feel comfortable. So as Keith was saying, it's more about the impact rather than actually the location. So if you specify the question, I'm sure the audience will respond very strongly.
Raoul, maybe you wanted to have the last word. You had the first one. You may have the last one.
Well, you asked me a question about climate, and I think, of course, Paris COP21 must succeed. That's for sure. But even if it doesn't succeed, in any case, businesses have the key in their hands for saving the planet. And like Keith has said, very often businesses can move faster than law. They can move faster than policymakers, and they should move faster. So COP21 is essential, but businesses, and I think the best recommendation the OECD could give to corporate leaders is join the B team.
Corinne, you wanted to add something?
I think it's quite appropriate, and it's an issue for business because we work at a global scale and we have to face the national laws, and very often national laws don't meet all together, and that's really an issue in all subjects.
You were some sort of guest star for us because you don't contribute very often, Jörg Asmussen, to this kind of forums. So it's quite an honor to have you here. Do you also believe that this COP21 summit cannot fail?
I mean, every summit in one is willing to participate cannot be a failure by definition. Yeah, but no, I think it's one of the key summits that we face this year. I mean, for the whole question of responsible business conduct and how we survive on this planet, this year is a very crucial year. Yeah, we will decide about the follow-up of the Millennium Development Goals. This is the key next hurdle that we face, and then we go up to the climate issue here in Paris. So it's a key year for us all on the globe. And this is, for example, why one then takes informal settings where a limited number of groups like the G7 meet. but it's an informal group where you can start to coordinate and think together and join forces. What do you do for the sustainable development goals, and what do you do on the climate field as well? So this is, in my view, there's always a big criticism in having these summits somewhere. I think they are worthwhile because they are informal, they are small, and they prepare major formal events that follow later in the year.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for attending this debate, and I hope you'll attend more debates, because there are plenty of more to come at the OECD these coming days. Thank you very much.